Celebrations on the streets of Ivory Coast after the International Criminal Court acquits former President Laurent Gbagbo of crimes against humanity. What will this mean for reconciliation in the country and the future of the ICC after this latest setback? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly by Thibault. He was the first former head of state to stand trial at the International Criminal Court. Laurent Gbagbo was arrested in Ivory Coast in 2011 and charged with crimes against humanity in connection with the violence that followed disputed presidential elections in 2010. 3,000 people were killed and more than 500,000 displaced during the unrest. But after a 3-year trial at The Hague, ICC judges said the prosecution had failed to show Gbagbo's involvement in the violence and ordered his release. Prosecutors say they will appeal against the ruling.
The chamber, by majority, Judge Herrera dissenting, rejects the prosecutor's request to maintain Mr. Gbagbo and Mr. Blégaudet in detention and directs the registry to obtain the necessary assurances from Mr. Gbagbo and Mr. Blégaudet and their respective lead counsel in ensuring the return of Mr. Gbagbo and or Mr. Blégaudet if and when their presence at the seat of the court is requested, as we said this morning.
For Gbagbo's supporters, the acquittal is a major victory, but victims of the post-election violence are vowing to continue the fight for justice. We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, Nicholas Hack has this report from Abidjan.
Supporters of former Ivory Coast leader Laurent Gbagbo celebrated as news of his acquittal spread across the country. And the International Criminal Court ordered his immediate release.
It is a moment of incredible joy. We feel like we all have been freed. He is our leader, our president, a man of peace.
80 witnesses gave evidence. Thousands of documents were produced. But after 7 years in prison, the judges say the prosecution failed to prove that Gbagbo and co-defendant Charles Blégaudet were guilty of crimes against humanity, including murder, rape, and persecution.
For all these reasons, the chamber, by majority, hereby decides that the prosecutor has failed to satisfy the burden of proof to the requisite standard as foreseen in Article 66 of the Rome Statute. Grants the defense motions for acquittal from all charges against Mr. Laurent Gbagbo and Mr. Charles Blégaudet.
Gbagbo was arrested in 2011, found hiding with his wife Simone in a hotel room in the Ivorian capital Abidjan. A humiliating moment for this former head of state unwilling to hand over power after an election defeat to Alassane Ouattara. Gbagbo's supporters, known as the Young Patriots, went from house to house killing anyone they thought were foreigners or supporters of Ouattara. 3,000 people were killed in the 4-month-long civil war. Now they are back on the streets in the popular neighborhood of Yopougon, a Gbagbo stronghold.
They chant, Gbagbo is finally free for the people of Yopougon. This is a cause of celebration. And this trial at the International Criminal Court has made him even more popular.
The judge's decision is a setback for prosecutors and thousands of victims of the civil war who continue to call for justice.
If Gbagbo is freed, the violence will come back and it could get even worse. Maybe another person will take power and create the same problems. We don't want to see him walk away from his crimes.
Gbagbo will still be considered a war criminal by some, a hero to others. This in a country trying to move on from a violent past in search of reconciliation and a brighter future. Nicholas Hawk, Al Jazeera, Abidjan.
Well, let's bring in our panel. Jim Wormington is on Skype from Abidjan, Ivory Coast. He's a researcher at the Africa Division of Human Rights Watch. Also on Skype from Dakar, Senegal, is Gilles Yabi, a political analyst and founder of the WATHI think tank. And in Berlin is Mark Kersten, deputy director of the Wayamo Foundation and author of Justice in Conflict, the Effects of the International Criminal Court's Interventions on Ending Wars and Building Peace. Gentlemen, thank you all for being on Inside Story. Thank you for joining us. Jim Wormington in Abidjan, the acquittal of Laurent Gbagbo celebrated, as we saw, by his supporters, but disappointment, of course, for the victims of the post-election violence of 2010-2011. What implications for peace and justice in Ivory Coast?
Well, I think that's the question that everybody is asking here in Abidjan. But I first want to touch on your point about victims. And as you saw in the reporting that preceded this conversation, this debate, there's no doubt that awful crimes were committed in Côte d'Ivoire in 2010, 2011. People were burnt alive in the streets. Women were raped. People were killed simply because of their political affiliation. And it's important to say that this decision doesn't change any of that. It simply shows that the prosecution was unable to connect in the court Gbagbo to what happened on the ground. And for many of the victims that I've spoken to, that's the contradiction. They know what they suffered. They know what they saw. And they find it very difficult to understand how a court located in The Hague, that with foreign judges and lawyers, can come to a different conclusion. In terms of what happens next in Côte d'Ivoire, I think that's the big question. The first narrative, of course, that's offered by Gbagbo supporters is that this is good for reconciliation. This will allow the country to come together. But of course, the other narrative is that many of the factors that underpinned the 2010-11 violence, the lack of security sector reform and reform in the army, and of course, most importantly, the complete impunity for crimes committed both by Gbagbo and Ouattara forces is still very much present.
All right. Gilles Yabi in Dakar, your thoughts. Is this good for reconciliation, as Gbagbo's supporters believe?
Well, I'm not sure that it is good for reconciliation. I'm not sure that this is going to change the political practices in the country. And my opinion has always been that lessons have to be drawn from the crisis that the country has witnessed. And the crisis was not the post-electoral crisis. The post-electoral conflict was just an episode in a very long conflict which has been, which has marked the country for two decades. And I'm not sure that currently we are not seeing kind of the reconfiguration, the political reconfiguration that will make the election in 2020 again polarized and possibly violent.
Indeed.
But I would like to come back to...
Yes, I was just going to touch on that point that you make. 8 years on, indeed, Gilles, the same political actors that led to the post-election violence of 2010 and 2011 are back in the picture, whether it's Gbagbo, Ouattara, Guillaume Soro, Charles Blé Goudet. How worrying is that for the upcoming election in 2020?
Yes, I think that is not a good sign. The fact that there is no clear recognition by all those personalities that they have been collectively responsible for what happened to the country. Again, not just what happened during the post-electoral conflict, but what happened in the country and destroyed the country for many years. And I think that the fact that we are seeing these actors, and we are also seeing institutions that have not been strengthened after the conflict, I think all these point to some reason to be worried about 2020. But again, I would like to come back to the decision itself, because I think it is important also to say that the decision by the ICC was logical in the sense that from the very beginning, the way this case has been handled by the ICC, and especially by the former prosecutor Luis Moreno Ocampo, I think this was problematic, and some investigation by Mediapart, French newspapers, made it very clear that there was too much political interference in the way the case has been handled. I never understood, for example, why they pick up Gbagbo and Blé Goudet and not, for example, a few military commanders and security actors around President Gbagbo, which would have made it possible to show the chain of command, from the political decision to the execution of violent acts on the ground.
Let's bring Mark in Berlin into the conversation. Mark, what do you think went wrong for the prosecution in the Gbagbo case? Is it the political interference, as Gilles in Dakar says?
Well, I think it's important, first of all, not to get too carried away from one event at the International Criminal Court. I think it's important to recognize that the ICC is neither as good as its greatest success nor as bad as its biggest failures. But this is worrying because clearly, if our expectation is, and maybe it shouldn't be, but if our expectation is that the ICC holds people to account and gets convictions for senior level perpetrators of atrocities, then this is disappointing. I think the judges were very clear in this instance that, quite frankly, they did not believe that the prosecution put forward good enough and sufficient evidence to proceed to the second stage of the trial. They don't believe that there's enough evidence to convict Laurent Gbagbo or Charles Blé Goudet beyond a reasonable doubt. And this, I think, sheds or casts doubt right now on the ability of the ICC Office of the Prosecutor to successfully gather enough evidence, in particular, to successfully prosecute high-level state officials. And this is, I think, a very worrying trend. We saw earlier this year Jean-Pierre Bemba, the former vice president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, before that the current president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, and the deputy president, William Ruto.
Indeed.
And now Laurent Gbagbo. So I think there's a very worrying trend that the ICC may not be able to hold senior state-level government officials to account when they allegedly perpetrate crimes.
Well, let's just pause for a moment, if we can, and give our viewers, Mark, some context, some background on the International Criminal Court and its work on Africa. The ICC is the world's first permanent war crimes tribunal. It was established in 2002. It took the court nearly a decade to deliver the first verdicts, finding Congolese rebel leader Thomas Lubanga guilty of recruiting child soldiers. There are 28 cases before the court. It's handed down 8 convictions and 2 acquittals in 6 of the cases. And it's indicted 44 people, including Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir and Saif al-Islam, the son of the late Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. Now, critics of the International Criminal Court have accused it of being biased towards Africa. In 2017, the African Union passed a motion urging its members to leave the tribunal. That's because all of the 44 people facing charge at the ICC are Africans, and 10 of the 11 countries under investigation are in Africa. Laurent Gbagbo's trial is the latest high-profile case against an African leader to collapse. As you heard last year, former Congolese Vice President Jean-Pierre Bemba successfully appealed against his conviction for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And in 2015, the ICC dropped charges against Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta due to a lack of evidence. Jim in Abidjan, what does this case say about the International Criminal Court and its ability to operate as the global instrument for international justice?
No, I think the first thing which Mark touched upon, of course, the judges at the court have to be fair both to defendants and to victims. And if, in this case, simply the prosecution didn't make its case, didn't bring enough evidence, then the judges were right to acquit Gbagbo and Blé Goudet, and we'll see what happens ultimately on appeal. So I think most of our focus should be on the lessons that the prosecutor can draw from this. Undoubtedly, these are difficult cases to prove. You have to show the connection between something that happens at a very local level, a killing or a rape, all the way up through the chain of command to the head of state, in this case, Laurent Gbagbo. That is difficult to do, but at the same time, the ICC is well-resourced and should have the expertise to do that. What I'd like to see is, as Gilles touched upon, a detailed examination of the strategy at the outset. Should, as Gilles said, there have been more pro-Gbagbo commanders arrested so that they could perhaps turn code against Gbagbo and testify against him? What was the implication of the court's failure to go after pro-Ouattara commanders right at the beginning, giving the court perhaps a bit more leverage to force strong cooperation from the Ouattara government in all of the cases? And then I think finally that question of, was the government of Alassane Ouattara completely forthcoming in all of the documentary evidence that they gave to the court, knowing that their relationship with the ICC, at least in the last few years, hasn't been perfect, and they've had technical but perhaps not perfect cooperation with it?
Gilles in Dakar, why do you think it was difficult to prove that connection between Laurent Gbagbo and the evidence? And coming back to the victims in Ivory Coast today, how much confidence do they still have in the international justice system?
Well, starting with the second question, I don't know if the victims will still have confidence in international justice. We have to wait till the end of this procedure, especially the appeal. But I think that we have to consider both what happened at the international justice level, but also what happened at the national justice level, because some investigation and some cases were also handled in Côte d'Ivoire itself. I think global opinion after all these years is that justice has not been a real justice, kind of impartial justice has not been really at the heart of the commitment of the new government itself. And the result is that, yes, we have a long crisis. We have had a lot of episodes of violence, including very serious violation of international humanitarian law. But at the end, it's not very clear, again, that lessons have been drawn and that the good signal has been given to the political actors and to the entire society on what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in the competition for power. Right. And that's why we could have a recurrence of violence again, because we have a sense that actually it is the impunity for all the crimes that have been committed.
Gilles, let me ask you, you mentioned President Ouattara. He has promised to deliver justice, but is there anyone right now to be held responsible for the crimes committed in 2010, 2011?
Again, a number of people were judged in Côte d'Ivoire itself, but then there was also a decision a few months ago by the President Ouattara for an amnesty of a lot of people who were freed from prisons. Again, I think justice has been really subdued to political decisions, and President Ouattara has been handling the post-electoral crisis, in a subtle way to preserve, of course, his own power, his own supporters. And we have to admit that it was difficult because, again, some people who were from the former rebellion had also to respond for crimes that were committed in the course of the conflict. And that way, for me, it was important not to look only at the crimes that were committed during the post-electoral conflict. Serious crimes were committed in Côte d'Ivoire from 2002, including some that were committed by the former rebels under the command of Guillaume Soro. So to answer your first question, I think the problem, again, is the sense that the ICC has identified the culprits of the people to be brought to the justice before investigating the various episodes of violence. Okay. And I think it should have been done the other way.
The other way around. Mark in Berlin, looking at the wider implications now for the International Criminal Court. The ICC needs a big win, but it's been racking up the losses. There are many countries, African countries, the United States President Donald Trump, who say that the ICC has no legitimacy, has no authority. How does the ICC change then to become more effective? And is this a damning moment for the court? Is this a nail in the coffin for the ICC?
Well, no, I don't think it's a nail in the coffin or a death knell. Again, I think we need to look at the wider picture. This is I think.
But when you look at the wider picture, ICC, Mark, there haven't been many wins, have there?
There have been a number of convictions, and I don't think, and I think this is an important point. I don't think that the full credibility and legitimacy of any criminal court should just be a measure of the number of convictions and acquittals. Of course, a credible court needs to have acquittals, would have acquittals. Of course, this is troubling for those who have expectations that the ICC will be able to successfully prosecute more individuals, particularly senior level government officials who have allegedly perpetrated war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So when that expectation isn't met, when there's that gap between what you expect or what we expect and what actually happens at the ICC, then there's a hit to the credibility of the court. But you mentioned yourself that one very popular conversation or argument is that the ICC is somehow biased against Africans and simply goes after fallen African leaders. I think this is actually quite a difficult argument to sustain when you have acquittals of high-level government officials who have fallen out of power or who are in power on the African continent. And again, you mentioned Bemba, Kenyatta, Ruto, and now Laurent Gbagbo and Charles Blé Goudé. It's hard to sustain the argument that the ICC is somehow biased against African leaders when they are acquitted and ordered to be released or cases collapse. I think that's perhaps a silver lining in the wider conversation about the ICC's legitimacy. But just to reiterate, I think what Jim said, what you want from a court like this that has a very difficult mandate and a very difficult mission, given all of the crimes that are occurring in the world. What you want is a court that learns from these types of mistakes, that looks at what happened and changes or adapts itself to be able to better investigate the right types of cases with the right types of evidence, so that victims who dedicate and sacrifice so much to be part of these proceedings, so that their expectations are eventually met, and so that there is more justice and accountability for these types of crimes. Again, I think particularly from government actors.
All right, Jim, in Abidjan, there are many countries, especially in Africa, who turn to the ICC because they're unable to bring prosecutions themselves. How does the ICC become more effective? How does it become more effective if it wants to be taken seriously?
Well, I think just to touch on your first point, and Côte d'Ivoire had a very strong national justice process to address the crimes of the 2010-11 crisis. WATHI, as Gilles said, had repeatedly promised that he would deliver justice to all sides. He set up a special task force of judges to investigate, and they actually managed to charge some really high-level commanders and officials, both from the Gbagbo side and the WATHI side. That was a huge step forward. But I think in Côte d'Ivoire particularly, what we should ask ourselves is why we haven't been able to build, as human rights groups, but obviously also particularly as Ivorian groups and Ivorian victims, why we haven't been able to build a broader coalition for justice to show that justice is an essential part of the peace equation in Côte d'Ivoire. And the failure to do that allowed WATHI in the summer to pass an amnesty with essentially no political consequences, probably positive political consequences for him in the short term. So I think one thing the ICC has to do is to continue to remain supportive of national justice. And perhaps one silver lining of this outcome is that governments and African civil society will have to think again about how to make justice something that can be delivered in African courts and African jurisdictions.
Yeah, Gilles, Yabi in Dakar, your thoughts on the future of the ICC and its role in Africa. Are you optimistic that this court can deliver justice for the victims, whether in Ivory Coast or other countries?
Yes, I'm optimistic. I'm a strong supporter of the ICC and the principle on which it was based, and I'm also a strong supporter of the reinforcement and strengthening of the national justice systems. I think that the ICC should, of course, be focusing on the most important crimes, that where it was created. But I do believe that, for all institutions, including for the ICC, personalities matters to provide integrity and to provide the confidence of the people. The main thing that has to change, I think, and the ICC is that people have to understand the rationale behind his procedures. People cannot understand, for example, for many years, why just one camp has been concerned by investigation, even if the prosecutor has been saying that people also who supported WATHI were being investigated. But clearly in Côte d'Ivoire, the message was not, could not be understood by the people if they have the sense that only one part of the victims are being considered. And I think that has to change, and people have to understand again the rationale behind any decision that is taken by the court.
All right. Mark in Berlin, I'll give you the last word. As we've said, a lot of criticism of the International Criminal Court from the US president, most notably. Is the ICC still up to the challenge to hold the world's most powerful to account?
I think that remains to be seen. But you cited Trump. He and his advisors are very concerned about the International Criminal Court. I think that's the only explanation, the only reasonable explanation for why they would so vehemently and vociferously criticize the ICC and have this kind of hissy fit towards the court, which means that maybe the ICC is doing some good work. Maybe they're not always convictions, but they're making powerful people worry about about the reach of the ICC, and I think that's a good thing, and that's a good thing for the ICC's credibility and legitimacy. It's ultimately, I think, people's hope is that the ICC will speak law to power. Whether it's able to do that through successful trials and prosecutions, again, I think remains to be seen. But I think it's clear that a lot of powerful leaders around the world are nervous and worried about the ICC, and every time they criticize the court, that becomes more and more clear. So I think we can have a degree of optimism that hopefully in the future the ICC will be able to bring successful cases against these types of alleged perpetrators.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for a very interesting discussion. Jim, Warmington, Gilles, Yabi, and Mark Kersten. And thank you for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, of course. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.